Hi, welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight, I'll be featuring the case of Paul Snider in the murder of Dorothy Stratten. So let's go ahead and find out more. Let's go ahead and dive on in. Paul Leslie Snider was born on April 15th, 1951. Dorothy Ruth Hugenstratton was born on February 28, 1960, in Vancouver, British Columbia. She was the oldest of three children. She had a brother, John Arthur, and a sister, Louise. Paul and Dorothy met in 1977. This was while she was working part-time at a local Dairy Queen in Vancouver, British Columbia. He went on to promote her by sending photos of her to Playboy. However, since she was underage, Dorothy's mother would have had to give written permission for the nude photos to be submitted. And she did. August 1978, Dorothy moved to Los Angeles, California. And here she was chosen as a finalist for the 25th anniversary Great Playboy Playmate Hunt. Now, in 1979, Dorothy decided to shorten her last name to something a little bit more simple, so she shortened it to Stratton. She also became Playboy's Miss August. In addition, she found work as a bunny at the Los Angeles Playboy Club. But that's not all. She also got the role and played Miss Cosmos in the Buck Rogers television series. At this time, Paul and Dorothy ended up getting married. With all of Dorothy's work so close to home, Paul assumed the role of his wife's chauffeur, as well as her manager and her acting coach. It was around this time, shortly after they got married, that their relationship became very strained. Paul became prone to fits of jealousy and controlling behavior. Paul's near constant presence, as well as his criticism of his wife and almost daily arguments with her, caused Dorothy so much stress that her coworkers at Playboy, they took notice of the tension in their relationship. Hugh Hefner even reportedly encouraged Dorothy to sever ties with Paul, calling him, quote, a hustler and a pimp, end quote. Paul had many money-making schemes, including forming the basic idea for what would one day become the Chippendales empire. However, Dorothy's friends still didn't really trust everything going on and warned Dorothy about Paul's behavior. Regardless of what was happening in her personal relationship, Dorothy was named Playboy's Playmate of the Year for 1980. But this didn't help anything in her marriage. By this time, their relationship had deteriorated so much to the point that they became separated by the summer of 1980. It didn't help matters that back in March 22nd, 1980, Dorothy had flown to New York. She was to begin work on what was to become her last film project, called They All Laughed. It was a romantic comedy being directed by Peter Bogdanovich. It was at this time that Dorothy started having an affair with Peter. Dorothy was doing promotional tours for her upcoming projects and purposely was telling Paul to stay back in Los Angeles. She knew the negative attention that Paul would bring and that his behavior would bring. But that wasn't the only reason. She also wanted to spend more time with Peter. Since Paul knew many of the club owners, he personally would negotiate for Dorothy and would collect her appearance fees. And then he would pocket the entire sum of what she made when she would return back home. Paul was finding it increasingly difficult to get in touch with Dorothy. In late June, just a few weeks after what was to be their first wedding anniversary, Paul received another letter from Dorothy. This one, however, stated that they were now going to be physically and financially separated. Paul didn't take this news very well at all. He responded by emptying the couple's joint bank account, and he had a brief affair with an old girlfriend. He was also convinced that Dorothy was having an affair with Peter Bogdanovich, so he hired a private investigator to gather evidence in his wife's infidelity. Paul, who was a foreign national living in the US, he didn't have a green card, and he had no other source of regular income. So he completely relied on Dorothy. Paul began selling a lot of Dorothy's Playmate of the Year prizes at a low cost just to get some quick cash. The most notable example was he sold her Jaguar sports car that Playboy had given her. It was valued at $26,000. Needless to say, he sold it for way less. July 30th, 1980, Dorothy and Peter returned to Los Angeles after having spent a 10-day vacation together in England. Her official Los Angeles residence was now at the address of a newly rented Beverly Hills apartment. But in actuality, she had quietly moved in to Peter's mansion in Bel Air. July 31st, 1980, Paul now became aware that his estranged wife was back in Los Angeles. And not only that, he found out she was living with Peter. So that night, he hid among the shadows just outside of the director's estate, carrying a borrowed handgun. He intended to shoot anyone who appeared at the entrance of the property. However, after several hours, there was no activity. So Paul grew impatient and he left. August 8th, 1980. At approximately 12 o'clock p.m. noon, Paul and Dorothy saw each other for the first time in nearly 3 months at Paul's house in West Los Angeles. Paul was confident that he would be able to convince Dorothy to take him back. But his hopes were quickly dashed when Dorothy told him that she was in love with Peter and she wanted to finalize her separation to Paul. Paul, well, he agreed to meet Dorothy one more time the following week to discuss a monetary settlement for their divorce. Later that afternoon, Paul returned the borrowed handgun to its owner. August 9th, 1980, Paul and the private detective that he had hired went to a local gun store. Paul was told by the owner that he could not buy a firearm because of his Canadian citizenship. So Paul asked the private detective to buy him the gun he wanted. The private detective instantly refused. August 10th, 1980, Paul met up with the private detective again. And again, Paul tried to convince him to buy him a gun, but this time not just any gun, a machine gun for, quote, home protection, end quote. Again, the detective immediately refused. August 11th, 1980, Paul drove out into the San Fernando Valley area to look at a gun that he had found for sale in the newspaper. But he got lost, so he wasn't able to find the owner's address. So he eventually gave up and went home. August 14th, 1980. At some point, Paul was able to obtain a shotgun and went to Dorothy and murdered her. And then he committed suicide in the West Los Angeles apartment that the two had previously shared. his body was found next to hers. A coroner's report showed that Paul died after Dorothy did. Sometime after midnight in the early morning of August 15th, 1980, the private detective telephoned the Playboy Mansion and told Hugh Hefner that Dorothy Stratten had been murdered. Peter was then called by Hugh Hefner. Peter ended up collapsing upon hearing this news and was sedated. Dorothy Stratten's mother was told of her daughter's death at her Vancouver area home later that morning by an officer of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Well, the interesting twist in this case was members of Paul's family petitioned a court to grant them all assets of both Paul and Dorothy by virtue of the fact that Paul had, quote, inherited, end quote, Dorothy's entire estate upon her death. Paul's family successfully got the estate. Dorothy was 20 years old at the time of her death. She is buried at Westwood Memorial Park in Los Angeles, California. And that is the case of Paul Snider in the murder of Dorothy Stratten. Thank you for sticking around for another episode of Danny After Dark. Do you have any questions or comments on the case? Leave it down below. Let's be interactive. Do you have a suggestion for a case that you'd like me to cover? Well, leave it down below. You may say it featured in an upcoming episode. Until next time, remember, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us.